get prepared. Today we're going to be talking about women's rights and talking about some of the various movements and some of the conventions and people and important elements of the women's rights movement. All of this is following up after talking about abolition and transcendentalism. Your journal today is on transcendentalism. Just going to follow up on that. Make sure you guys are keeping up. Make sure you answer all 5 parts. You do not have to do the last part here. So if you've listened to the lecture, you know you do not have to do this, and you won't email me saying, hey, Coach Wilson, this link doesn't work anymore. I don't know that Blubber's even still a website anymore. But anywho, so today we're going to talk about women's rights. It's Unit 4, Day 10. Here are your 2 essential questions. First off, what were the effects of the women's rights movement? Really straightforward. We'll talk about some of those. And then how did women advocate for their rights? And that's talking about here in the 1830s and 40s and 50s, not so much like modern day. I'm not looking for a modern day answer there in regards to women's rights. Now, in 1820 through really all the way up till the 1920s, obviously it changed a little bit here and there, but not a ton. Women's rights were very limited, could not be on a jury, could not hold office, could not vote. If you were a woman and you got married and you owned any land, your land became your husband's, or your property did as well. And then if he died, that property and land didn't actually go back to you. It actually stayed with your husband's family, and then it would actually go back to his family, not you. So you basically had 0 rights, and then if you didn't get married, people criticized you and called you names and all sorts of bad things because you didn't have a husband. So it's kind of a no-win situation here for women during the 1830s, on into Civil War period, etc. There were also no laws against abuse, and such as domestic disputes between husbands and wives. And that was something, guys, it doesn't seem like a big thing to maybe some people in society, because you're growing up in a really good home, or you're growing up around things that you never see this. But some people see this stuff firsthand, and imagine there being no protection for either spouse in a relationship, that there's no laws against abuse. That's very concerning. So women are going to start to call for reforms during this time. Also included some funny pictures for you down here. You had to wait 6 hours to vote. That must have been awful. That is Elizabeth Cady Stanton, I believe. And I can't remember the other. Oh, nope, sorry, that's the Grimke sisters. I lied. Then the second one is Mitt Romney. This was back when he was still running for president. What do you mean women can vote? Like he did not know. All right. The cult of domesticity. Now, when we start talking about women and how people view women, this is kind of the central theme or central idea. Women are believed to be in this group where they should be pious, they should be pure, they should do things around the house and be domestic, and they should be submissive to their husbands, meaning they do what their husbands ask them to do. Normally only applied to rich white Protestants in regards to who kind of fell into this category. But there's still this belief in the 1800s that once you're married, you should take care of the home and the children if you're a woman. That's your job. That's what God called you to do. That's what it is the norm for you to do. Going out and working a job in a factory, or being a manager, or being someone of any type of power is not your role as a woman in society. At least in the 1840s, that's how they viewed it. Not saying that's how it should be. Now, the Grimke sisters, down here in the bottom, this is an appeal to the Christian women of the South, a book they wrote. And essentially what happened was they were touring plantations. They were from South Carolina, and they were trying to give first-hand accounts of what slavery was like on their father's plantation while they were in the North. And they became these advocates not only for women's rights, but they actually advocated for abolition as well. And one thing you're going to see over the next probably 15 to 20, 30 years, all the way till we get to the Civil War, you're going to see that women and African Americans tended to put their causes together, and that they tended to, if they were going to protest or they were going to try to fight for a specific cause, they were doing it together because they were both kind of in the same plight. African Americans are slaves, and yes, women aren't slaves, but they basically have the same rights as an African American. They just aren't technically slaves and forced to manual labor, but if they are married, they're forced to take care of the children, so I don't really see the difference completely there. The Seneca Falls Convention, this took place in 1848. This is kind of one of those major events that we talk about when we're talking about the women's rights movement as a whole. Some of the major figures was Elizabeth Cady Stanton. I was right. That was Elizabeth Cady Stanton. I knew it was. I'm sorry, guys. If we go back, I'm going to take us back two pictures. Hold on. Let's see. Where is it? Oh, one too far. Yeah. One on the left is Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Not sure about the one on the right. I knew that was her. I doubted myself. And then Lucretia Mott, who was there at the bottom right. Both of these were two very important figures in the women's rights movement, specifically there in the 1840s. And Stanton is probably one of those that is the most involved because she helps organize this women's rights convention, as well as she was very active in the anti-slavery movement. And then Lucretia Mott actually helps write the Declaration of Sentiments, which we'll talk about here in just a second. The purpose of the convention was to discuss the social, civil, and religious condition and rights of women. So women's, how they're being treated in society, what their rights should be, etc. Now, they issue this Declaration of Sentiments and Resolutions. And the easiest way I can explain this to you, I've written out here on the slide, which is a Declaration of Independence for women. And basically, Stanton's focus was that, what's the line they put there in the Declaration of Independence? Gosh, I can't think of it right now. But a list of rights for men and all men are created equal, but she wrote all men and women are created equal. Okay, she was really focused on making it to where women were included in the conversation. They were included in the right to vote. And she felt like that women should have power in the government, whether it's at least a vote, and to have some sort of power in who's ruling over them. Because here's the thing, guys. Women are raising children in this country, and women are they're contributing daily to the foundation of the society and the men that are being raised. Why shouldn't they have a voice in voting? It was kind of her argument. All right, here's a look at the role. And as we talked about with abolition, we talked about white men being involved in the abolitionist cause. You also had white women and white men who were involved in that, but you had white men who were involved in the women's rights movement as well. And having that opposite group involved was so important because it had it kind of gave you the other side of the argument. If it was only women advocating for the right to vote during this time, it would have been like, okay, yeah, it's a bunch of women, da-da-da. But having the men there too, and you can see it was a large group of men in it. I guarantee you if you went through and you Googled at least half of those names, you would come up with something major that they did in society or something influential. So these are influential people. It's important to note that they're not just some random names on a document. All right. Moving through quickly here because I want to talk about Sojourner Truth. The women's suffrage movement, this is kind of where it got its foundation. So, we're talking all the way till we get to Woodrow Wilson and World War I. We're talking about women's suffrage. And suffrage itself is just the right to vote. So if you Google the word suffrage, it's going to be the right to vote. So when you say women's suffrage, it's the women's right to vote. And as I said, Cady Stanton is going to be kind of one of the major figures. In the 1860s, like I said, women are allowed to keep property if husband died. So that's a change that she advocates for and gets changed before the Civil War. And women's rights are going to actually grow stronger as a result of what Stanton does at this convention and then on into the Civil War. Now, we'll talk about when we get to the Civil War, the American Red Cross and how that got started. That is one of those things that's going to help advocate for women as well. Now, Sojourner Truth, her real name was Isabella Baumfree. She was a former slave, sold as a child, and she was known for her powerful speeches on women's rights. And one of the neat things about Sojourner Truth is she was well spoken for an African American woman. Not to say that African American women weren't intelligent in that time period, but saying that they didn't receive the same education that white people were receiving at that time, because African Americans, as we talked about in abolition, with abolition yesterday, or I guess it was Friday, I keep saying yesterday, as we talked about abolition on Friday, a lot of Southerners were trying to keep African Americans away from education and formal education, because if they could keep them from being able to read, it would keep them from being able to find out about some of the things going on in our country, specifically these abolitionist movements. Now, she also traveled around the country speaking about her experiences and promoting women's rights. And guys, we're going to look at her speech today, one that was documented and one that was actually given, and then you're going to actually watch one. But all three are very powerful, and they're very similar. You're going to notice that they're very similar because they're basically the same speech. But it's very, very interesting to listen to her talk and to hear the things she says and some of the reasons she gives, they're very, very common sense answers that, I mean, even as I thought, they're very smart things to use for promoting women's rights. Now, one of the other things that women's rights movements got kind of connected to other than abolition was the temperance movement. And the reason this was is women were looking for anything to tie their cause to that could basically kind of tell in with it. So one of those things was being the abuse of alcohol and kind of the moderation in the consumption of alcohol. And that's what temperance is. Temperance is trying to minimize the amount of alcohol that is being consumed. And the reason that women were behind this is because they saw the abuse of alcohol on the children and themselves and their financial well-being at home. And that's going to lead to, and I'm going to show you this picture here in a second, them coming up with some different documentation showing that it hurt the family, etc. 1833, the American Temperance Movement starts, and then temperance and women's virtue becomes kind of tied together. Okay, so I want you to read this if you get a chance, from the first glass to the grave, and it basically just goes through the stair-step process of what happens, and eventually death by suicide is the final thing here, and you can see it leaves the wife and child alone. The Drunkard's Progress is what that picture was called. That's a political cartoon from that time period. All right, so two things. Number one, do not do this assignment. All right, this is not part of what you're doing today. I have put on canvas what you are doing. This right here is the speech. If you want to watch this, we're not going to watch it right now. You could pull that up if you would like to. Here are your two vocabulary words, the Seneca Falls Convention and Sojourner Truth. Really easy on the vocabulary today. And then the last thing